Hello and welcome to today's webinar, gathering 315 registrants from all over the world and representing regulators, operators, tower companies and ministries. Today, our webinar will focus on the tower companies, also known as TowerCo ecosystem. During the next hour, we will discuss this market, but also recent mergers and acquisition, as well as policies and regulation affecting TowerCo operations. And this time, it's fair to say that it will not be 4, but 2 non-blondes that will ask the question, what's going on? So before we start, let's go through some practical information. So you can see here an example of your interface. You will see that you can get the slides in the document section, and you also have the question tab where you can ask all your questions. I will come back to that. And just also to say that today's webinar is recorded, so you will be able to access the recording as from tomorrow. Today we have with us Elena from Rome. And she's the head of our global research. And she has joined Cullen International in 2009, and before that she was working with Telecom Italia and also the World Bank. We also have the pleasure of having Javier Morales from Peru. Javier is a regulatory analyst for the Americas and our Global Trend Service. He follows digital economy and media developments in Peru, India, and South Africa. Before joining us, Javier previously worked for Telefonica and the Peruvian regulator Ociptel. So I get back to the questions. So you will be able to ask the questions during the whole webinar, and we will take them at the end during the Q&A session. And if we don't have the time to address all questions, don't worry, we will reply to you by email. So don't hesitate really to ask your question. And at the end of the webinar, you will be also invited to leave us some feedback. This is important for us to improve ourselves, but it's also a good action for the planet, because for each feedback we receive, we will plant a tree. So really don't hesitate to give us feedback and to tell us what you want to hear about in our future webinars. This is also very interesting for us. So that's it for me. Thank you, and Elena and Javier, for being with us today. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here today with you and with my colleague Javier Morales from Peru. So greetings from Rome, very rainy day today, and we're going to discuss the tower companies ecosystem. But before doing that, I just wanted to remind those who don't know about Cullen just who we are. Cullen International is a company based in Belgium, but with a global outreach. Actually, we have clients in all parts of the world, and we cover different type of regulatory and policy research in around telecommunication, media, digital economy, postal competition, radio spectrum, consumer protection, and also about sustainability. The outreach is global, so I am proud to say that with Javier Morales and other colleagues, including Andre Gomez, James Thompson, and others, we launched Global Trends. And in one of the latest researches that we did in Global Trends was exactly about tower companies. So today we're going to discuss about what we found out about the global tower ecosystem. Cullen International has 35 years of experience. We cover about 70 countries, and we really have colleagues in different parts of the world across all continents. We have around 300 clients right now, and our clients are typically regulatory authorities, but also telecommunication operators, broadcasters, platform providers, associations, so different type of of clients. And we really are neutral, so our analysis have a coverage that really reflects what is going on, what is official, and we really try to make our analysis as simple as possible for our clients to deep dive into an increasingly complicated regulatory ecosystem across the sectors that we cover. So about tower companies, as I was saying before, this is today we're going to present the results of a recent research that we carried out at the Global Trend Service. It has really a global scope because it covers the tower ecosystem in many different jurisdictions around the world. Javier Morales will discuss several aspects. So the agenda is essentially divided in three parts. Initially, Javier will will give an overview of the global tower company market. So about tower infrastructure and essentially what is going on and what is changing in this ecosystem. I will then cover the recent restructurings and merger and acquisitions involving tower assets around the world. So I will provide some details. Of course, a lot has been happening recently, and I will try to give an overview of this dynamism that is taking place in this market. And the third part of the presentation is about the regulatory trends in the tower company ecosystem. So what are the regulatory frameworks that matter for the infrastructure players in this sector, and also what are the main regulatory challenges depending on the tower market structure in the different parts of the world. In the end, we will address some of your questions. Don't worry, you can write, and we will come back to you, trying to do our best to answer your questions, but we will answer a few questions if there is sufficient time available. So now I will give the word to Javier. So Javier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elena. Good morning to everyone here from Peru. So we will start discussing this topic of the global tower company market. Please, the next slide. We will start by introducing some basic concepts of cell towers. A cell tower is a physical structure built mainly to sustain, to hold telecom antennas. As you can see in the slide, there are different types of cell towers. By their design, they are classified in a monopole tower, that is a single pole, a lattice tower, that is like a vertical tower, but with a design of a rectangular or triangular basis. A guide tower is like a monopole tower with a pole, but sustained with guide wires. And the cell tower is a monopole tower, but in disguise. These kind of towers are usually in urban areas where there is need of control of the visual impact. On the other hand, by their installation, towers are classified in ground-based towers that are installed on the ground with a suitable foundation, and rooftop towers that are above the roof of a high-rise building. Now, factors that determine that impact in the tower design are the geographical location and population density of the area, the area height, the possibility to extend the tower, the size and weight of each component, the cost of maintenance, the aesthetic appearance, among others. It is important to distinguish between cell sites and cell towers. Cell sites are all kinds of equipment that transmit cell signals. So cell sites include cell towers, but also other kinds of assets such as small cells and distributed antenna systems. Indeed, apart from towers, many mobile operators use multiple technologies that complement the coverage provided by these macro towers, such as small cells and digital antenna systems, among others. However, despite the growing use of these new technologies, it's important to realize that macro towers will continue to be the core of these wireless networks. So having defined cell towers, in the next slide, we will define what are tower companies. And tower companies are specialized companies that will operate and lease tower space to mobile operators. Towers are used as passive infrastructure that host active elements for one or more mobile operators. As you can see in the slide, there are different typical tower components. Components related to the passive infrastructure, such as the physical site, the mast, the batteries, the rack, shelter, cooling, generator, the power grid, and the fence, are usually owned by the tower companies, while the components related to the active elements, those elements that are related to activate the network, are owned by mobile network operators that are the tenants. Those active elements are the panel antennas, the microwave antennas, the fenders, connectors, and the telecom equipment. In general, generally, mobile tower companies enter the market through an anchor client and grow through colocation, acquisitions, and build-to-suit. An anchor client usually is the first mobile operator with a long-term contract, including a discount in the lease rate with each tower that is shared with an additional mobile operator. Colocation is the lease space to one or more tower. Build-to-suit is when a tower company constructs new towers for the infrastructure deployment of the anchor client. And acquisition is acquiring new site. That is the topic Elena will talk about in the second part about mergers and acquisitions. So in the next slide, we will see a little more about what is the business model of these tower companies. In order to do that, we will use some figures provided by American Tower. That is the largest tower company in the United States. This company leases tower space to several tenants. So revenues through rental charges are based on the local property, the lease space on the tower, the weight placed on the tower for each active element of the mobile operator. On the other hand, the operating expenses include expenses related to the land rent, the insurance, monitoring, rental, real estate taxes, utilities and fuel, cost of maintenance, among others. Usually, contracts are not cancelable. Contracts include initial long term of 10 years and are several times renewable. The lease is escalation is based on the rate inflation. So based on figures provided by American Tower in the United States, you see that different revenues and operating expenses for one tenant, two tenants, and three tenants. And we conclude that adding tenants, equipment, and upgrades results in significantly higher returns as revenue is added with minimal incremental costs. Indeed, regarding valuation, while traditional mobile operators are valued at 6 times their annual operating margin, tower companies can be worth at 21 times their margin. That disparity is explained because tower companies are seen as low-risk businesses, since they generate constant cash flow over long periods. Of course, tower companies have few risks also. No? For example, there are risks involved with local government approvals for deploying towers. You know, in some communities, they restrict the deployment of towers, among other reasons, for the visual impact. Moreover, if the land under the tower is to be leased, there is also the risk that after the expiration of the contract with the landowner, the land rent will be much higher. Additionally, if two mobile operators that are current clients decide to merge, the tower company will lose one client. Now, despite these kind of risks, the opportunities that are available to these tower companies make them an attractive business for international investors. On the other hand, instead, in the case of the telecom sector, this is a technological complex business with multifaceted businesses that face strong competition from new entrants, such as the over-the-top companies. In some regions, the telecom sector has gone growth. For example, that is the case in Europe, that the aggregate revenue from the European telcos has grown with a constant rate of 1% in the past years. So in the next slide, we see some different models of ownership. As we said before, in the last decade, this market structure, this ownership model has experienced a fundamental change. For example, in 2014, mobile operators own over 90% of towers worldwide. No? At that moment, mobile operators considered that towers was part of their core business. However, currently, at the Q3 of 2022, mobile operators own around 26% of towers worldwide. What means that these new companies, the tower companies, own 66% of towers worldwide. This separation allow mobile network operators to reduce their CAPEX and OPEX in order to invest in their core business, such as upgrading the network for 5G. Moreover, this change could be also understood by the interest of international investors, such as pension funds and security companies, in looking for low-risk investments. We see after separation, the tower companies' sum of the parts market capitalization can increase up 40% when compared with the original integrated mobile network operator. So we see that there are different kind of ownerships for these new tower companies. Basically separated in tower companies that are controlled by the mobile operators, but as other companies separated from the mobile operator, and independent companies who are not controlled by mobile operators, but for private funds. In the first case of mobile tower companies that are controlled by mobile operators, we can distinguish between the tower company who is owned only by one operator, where the parent mobile operator maintains an equity above 50% of the carved-out tower infrastructure, such as Amplitel in Australia, where that is owned by Telstra, and Vantage Towers in Europe, that is owned by Vodafone. There are also tower companies who are owned by more than one operator. They are joint ventures formed by two or more mobile network operators. That is the case of China Tower Corporation in China, that is owned as a joint venture by the three mobile operators there, China Telecom, China Mobile, and China Unicom. The same happens with Indus Tower in India, with Airtel and Vodafone. On the other hand, independent tower companies are tower companies that can either be fully independent from the mobile network operator or have one or more operators among its minority shareholders. That is the case of American Tower in United States and Cellnex in Europe. You see that, not surprisingly, the average tenancy ratio for tower companies who are controlled by operators is 1.3, while the average tenancy ratio for independent tower companies is 2.4. That is because of neutrality, the carrier neutrality problem. So mobile tower companies who are owned by mobile network operators could be, these mobile network operators could give better services to themselves rather than the other tenants. So in the next slide, we will see how many towers there are worldwide, and we see that around the world by region, but worldwide there are 5 million towers, around 5 million towers, according to Tower Exchange. We see that around 40% of those towers, 2 million towers, are placed in China. And they are owned basically by these joint venture tower companies, China Tower Corporation. This massive amount of towers in China is explained because in 2023, the government decided to centralize this policy and deploy networks in the 90% of rural mountainous areas. So 20 years ago. In here, most importantly, is to notice that more than 70% of these 5 million towers are owned by tower companies. In fact, indeed, at 3/4 2022, this figure is 74%. As we saw before, is in China, the penetration of tower companies is 100%. In North America, in the United States, is around 100%. Also, is like because that is in that country is when this kind of model emerged. American Tower, for example, was created in the 90s. Other regions like Europe, countries in Asia Pacific and Latin America are following these trends in consolidation, following this model of United States. However, in other regions in Africa, in the Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, there are countries with no tower company or very few of them. That is very important when considering the kind of regulation to be implemented that we will see in the last part. So finally, in the last slide of this first part, we will see that these 5 million towers, when analyzed by tower companies, we see that worldwide there are around 325 tower companies who own and operate around 3.7 million towers. That means around 74% of towers worldwide, according to Tower Exchange. And importantly, to notice the concentration of these towers worldwide. We see China Tower, 2 million towers, but there are other 4 tower companies who own more than 102,000 towers. Those are American Tower in the United States, Indus Tower and Summit Digital Infrastructure in India, and Cellnex in Europe. Those 5 tower companies concentrate around 71% of tower companies, while 281 tower companies around the world own less than 5,000 towers, and together represent around 7% of tower sites. So this is globally, but it's important to notice that when analyzing tower companies, we need to analyze them by market, that is by jurisdiction, by countries. No? And in our jurisdiction that we analyze, 12 jurisdictions, but in 2 of them, Singapore and Korea, there are no tower companies. In the 10 other jurisdictions, we found that there are the 3 largest. We analyzed the 3 largest tower companies, and we had interesting findings regarding internationalization of these companies' markets, ownership, difference in ownership, in market structure, in the service they provide, and the clients they serve. For example, we found that most of the tower companies operate only in one of these jurisdictions. So then they operate in one country. But there are other tower companies that operate in regionally or globally. For example, Cellnex operate in all Europe, and American Tower is a global company in different regions around the world. We found also differences in ownership, in share. In China, the market is concentrated in only one tower company, but for example, there is more homogeneous market in Brazil, in India, in South Africa. We also found that in all 26 tower companies that we analyze in the different jurisdictions, there is always one tower company in these 10 jurisdictions. In the case of Brazil and the United States, all the 3 largest tower companies are independent. We also see that in Brazil, United States, and Europe, the tower companies offer not only passive infrastructure, but also active infrastructure. See, in general, we could see that there are many differences in those markets. So in the next part, Elena will talk about merger and acquisitions.
Thank you very much, Javier. So in my part, let's say that considering also the limited time available, I focused my short analysis on 3 regions. And what is important to highlight is the fact that this sector is under transformation. On one hand, we have, let's say, the typical restructuring of mobile network operator, as Javier explained. So from vertical integration to tower spin-off and creation of own tower companies with their own structure, shareholdings, and so on. We have the independent tower companies that are growing, they're consolidating, they are acquiring either tower assets that are being disposed by mobile network operators, or they're acquiring smaller independent tower companies. And then we have another type of trend that is quite important, is the fact that several institutional investors have been investing considerably in tower companies of different types. So the shareholding structure has been evolving over the years. So let's start from the Americas. So in the Americas, you see that in the slides that I prepared, I only focused on relevant transactions that took place since the year 2020, so the past 3 years. And plenty of things happened in the Americas region. And let's say that there were some kind of operations that involve, for example, American Towers that keeps on growing also in North America. And so there were, so for example, there was an acquisition inside towers involving, let's say, towers in the US mainly, but also a few in Canada. There was also a very important transaction by American Towers regarding the acquisition of Telxius. And in this case, let's say that overall, this transaction allowed the addition of almost 31,000 towers from 4 Latin American countries plus 2 in Europe. We will see that a bit more in detail. But what is important to see is that, let's say that this US group is really growing, as well as another independent tower company in the US that is Phoenix Towers. Phoenix Tower acquired, made acquisitions in the US, but for example, they acquired the Tower Ventures, that is an independent tower company in the United States, plus let's say a company that manages towers development. But most of the acquisition of Phoenix happened in other regions, as we can see later. For example, just to stay in the Americas, in LATAM, Phoenix Towers acquired around 5,000 towers owned by the third mobile network operator of Chile, WOM, and in this case, let's say that there is this inorganic growth that is taking place by these tower companies that are acquiring, as I explained, either smaller tower companies or acquisition of assets that were disposed by the mobile network operator towers. Also, many other transactions took place in Brazil. Let's say that many transactions actually took place even before 2020, but we have to see here that, for example, this year, Highline, that is owned by Digital Bridge, that is another infrastructure group, acquired the assets, the tower assets of 2 concession holders, so 2 mobile network operators and fixed network operators, actually integrated companies that somehow restructured their tower activities. One is the case of Oi. In the case of Oi, actually, the acquisition regarded assets, tower assets used for fixed services, including, for example, poles, but also towers as such. And Algar Telecom is a regional company, and let's say also in this case there was this restructuring of the tower assets. Also, another group that has been growing is IHS, and there were acquisitions, for example, both in Brazil, Centennial Towers. So in 2021, these assets were around 600 towers in Brazil and another 200 in Colombia. So it's not a huge operation, but we will see that For example, also in the case of AHS, an independent tower group, they have been growing dramatically over the past few years. And indeed, they made many acquisitions, not only in Latin America, but also in other regions, including, for example, in Africa, where they have become the largest tower company operating in that continent. Now, since we have limited time, I would go to Europe, and here, I mean, it's you can see from this slide, I just selected some of the transactions that took place over the past 3 years. So a lot going on in this sector. Actually, at Calen, our competition law service also has been monitoring and describing, analyzing very much in detail many of these transactions. Transactions that regarded, on one hand, let's say the creation of, let's say, independent tower companies, and then the sale of assets. On the other, acquisitions by independent tower companies, acquisition, for example, of assets disposed by mobile network operator. By far, the most important transactions regarded, on one hand, the Cellnex that acquired a number of towers in actually, I think in 6 countries in Europe in 2021, and that in practice they added in these transactions 36,000 more towers approximately to their existing tower assets already owned. And so we can see that in addition to these acquisitions by Cellnex, there were usually also some commitment regarding other deployments, the build-to-suit deployments. So in practice, commitment to deploy more networks where necessary in each of the different countries covered. So there were acquisitions in also apart from Hutchison Towers in 2021, also acquisition, for example, of 3 different acquisitions in Portugal. And Cellnex acquired towers from MNO, from MNOs, and also from Omtel. And so it's, let's say that they added around more than 5,000 new towers under their portfolio just in this country. Then there were also acquisition, for example, in France, Altai's assets, and also in Italy, in the UK, and in Poland. In Poland, it's quite interesting because actually the acquisition also regarded part of active infrastructure, not just the passive infrastructure. So each of these transactions was carried out by a local subsidiary of Cellnex, and let's say each of these transactions were reviewed by the national competition authorities. Then there were other acquisitions, for example, Phoenix, that we mentioned in the previous analysis of the Americas region, acquired, for example, made the 2 acquisitions, one in Ireland in 2020, and another one regarded assets owned by Monaco Telecom, a company called Epic, owned by Monaco in Cyprus and Malta. Then we have also important restructuring in Europe was about the entry of new investors in tower companies owned by mobile network operator. That is the case, for example, of Digital Bridge and Brookfield Asset Management that acquired the 51% stake in Deutsche Telekom tower company called GT Tower. And also another very important initiative was in Italy, the creation of INWIT through a joint venture between Vodafone Italy and TIM in 2020. And of course, Vodafone also launched there was the IPO, let's say, of the tower company Vantage Towers, created by Vodafone. Interestingly, there was an announcement just a few days ago about, other changes of ownership in, for example, in Vantage Towers. So that is to say that this sector is extremely dynamic in all continents. So we can see also in Asia Pacific, that is the next slide. In Asia Pacific, I only focused on 4 markets because it's actually 5 if we also include the New Zealand. Let's say that many things happened here also over the past the past 3 years. First of all, the restructure and the creation of Indo Towers. So there was these big mergers between Bharti Infratel and this Indus Tower that created a group owning around 180,000 towers. So it's a mega merger. And also there was another very important transaction in India that regarded another important mobile network operator, that is Reliance Jio. And in this case, there was the acquisition by Brookfield Infrastructure of approximately 135,000 towers. So the dimension of this type of mergers in some countries are really massive compared with Europe, where the number of course, of assets is more limited because it's quite fragmented across many different countries. But if we consider another market where there is a lot of movement in the tower sector, it is Australia. Australia is a very interesting case because on one hand, we saw a very important restructuring of the incumbent operator Telstra Group. Telstra created, let's say, Amplitel as a legal entity in 2021. This structure has been, let's say, has been quite a complex exercise, and I understand it was completed only recently, a few weeks ago. But let's say that with this restructure, Telstra is now, of course, the largest tower company in Australia, and also there is in this moment considerable debate about possible, let's say, agreement with the third mobile operator, TPG. And the possibility to share some, say, active elements, including spectrum in rural areas of Australia. So it's there are some complexities around, let's say, this restructuring. But apart from this, also the independent tower ecosystem has been evolving in Australia, because there were several mergers and acquisitions. For example, the ATN group that was born from, let's say, the spin-off of the activities of the second largest operator, Optus, that is owned by Singtel in Australia. They acquired Axicom, that is another quite large tower company. And in this case, let's say, the company has become now the second largest tower group in the continent of Australia. And it is important to remark that the ownership of ATN is Australian Super, that is, let's say, a financial investor, a superannuation, a pension fund in Australia. and also there were this kind of interests by another group, a Canadian group, is called OMERS, and this company acquired assets from Steelmark, that is a small independent tower company in Australia, and also a part of the towers owned by TPG. Just as a reminder for those who are not familiar with Australia, TPG is the result of a merger that took place was completed in 2020 between Vodafone Australia and TPG. There are also two markets that have been extremely dynamic over the past 2 years, and these are Indonesia and the Philippines. Let's say that these companies, let's say in this case, there were a significant restructuring by some of the mobile operators. That is the case, for example, in Indonesia of Telkom Indonesia. Telkomsel is the mobile arm of this company, and Telkomsel has created a large infrastructure group that is called the Mitratel. In practice, Mitratel was created as an independent tower company that in the past 2 years acquired over 60,000 towers from Telcosem Group. In practice, there was this carve out of the activity and put under the Mitratel Group, that now is a huge infrastructure company in Indonesia. And also there was another acquisition. In this case, it was Protelindo who acquired STP. These are two independent tower companies in Indonesia that merged in 2021. And in this case, the tower involved were almost 7,000. Then E.Co also is a very important infrastructure group. I understand that it is co-owned by the Axiata Group that is present in several markets in the Asia Pacific region. And E.Co and Digital Bridge each acquired approximately 3,000 towers from PLDT, that is a large mobile operator in the Philippines. And also in the Philippines, Globe Towers, that is, let's say that there are two very large operators in the Philippines. One is PLDT, the other one is Globe. They, let's say that Globe sold approximately 5,000 towers to two companies from the Philippines. One is Frontier Towers, that is an independent tower company, and the other one is Mescor, that is a company actually co-owned by, I understand, the electricity company of Manila. So it's, let's say that all these are only examples of the many acquisitions and mergers that took place. In New Zealand, for example, just a few weeks ago, there was the announcement of two funds. One is Infrared and the other one is Northleaf from Canada, that acquired 80% of Vodafone towers in New Zealand. And just a few days ago, Vodafone decided even to rebrand under a new name called One. If we go to the next slide, I want to just point out a concluding remark about the relevance and the significance of these mergers and acquisitions in this moment. So what is happening? Until now, despite all this great movement of mergers and acquisitions, most of the transactions were approved by competition authorities without conditions. In some cases, they even didn't need to be notified to the authorities because they were below certain thresholds. So now what is happening in the most recent years is to see that a few transactions are starting to raise some concerns. So apart from, for example, in Italy, apart from the INWIT joint venture that of course had to be approved, and it was approved with the conditions by the antitrust authority of Italy, the acquisition of the almost 9,000 towers from Hutchison by Cellnex was also approved with conditions. So it was subject to provision of access to a new entrant mobile network operator, that is Iliad in Italy, and also access to, under non-discriminatory terms and conditions, to fixed wireless providers in Italy, in municipality below 35,000 inhabitants. In Italy, there are a few fixed wireless providers. Eolo, for example, is one of them. It's let's say it's a market that where the antitrust authority found the need to put some safeguards regarding entrance and protection of the smaller operators. In the case of the UK also, the Cellnex acquisition of Hutchison Towers, in this case we're talking about 6,600 sites, we see that the competition authority, the CMA, decided to order the disposal of approximately 1,100 towers in the country, and they were sold to Wireless Infrastructure Group by Brookfield. And then also in South Africa, there was this sale of MTN sites to AHS, and in this case the Commission imposed a different type of let's say of obligation, including, for example, representation of minorities, of certain groups in the ownership structure. So I close here because I know that we are a bit late. So Javier, up to you about the regulation.
Thanks, Elena. So we will try to simplify here the topic of tower regulation, given the time is possible. So please, next slide. Well, in the telecom sector, it's a heavy regulated sector. You know, in the traditional regulation for mobile operators include rules on consumer protection, price, such as the quality of service, price regulation in the retail and wholesale market, regulation on spectrum for example, for licenses and efficient use of the spectrum, regulation of site deployment and sharing. This last topic about site deployment and sharing is related to infrastructure regulation in general, and in our case, is related to regulation of towers. So in the past, towers have not been subject to heavy regulation. That is because mobile operators usually deploy duplicating infrastructure, so no mobile operator could abuse its dominance in the wholesale market to gain advantage in the retail market. Moreover, the densities of macro towers have remained the same from 2G to 4G because these technologies use mainly low to mid bands. However, with the emergence of tower companies and the introduction of 5G, there has been a concern about how to create a new framework for these new actors and these new technologies. Indeed, most of tower companies were created through the carve out and sale of existing towers, as Elena said. So from mobile operators, that means that the towers move away not only from mobile operators, but also from traditional regulation. And nowadays, tower companies and mobile operators have a kind of symbiotic relationship. On the one hand, mobile tower companies depend on operators as clients, but also mobile operators are dependent of a few strong infrastructure players like the tower companies. So there are concerns about how to, regulators, policymakers, competition authorities, and local governments, how to regulate these new strong players. So in the next slide, we will see a little about this new approach. So regarding, you see, site deployment and sharing, we continue to be applicable to mobile operators who still maintain the control of towers, but also these new companies, tower companies. Apparently, these are the same kind of measures: uniform frame of rules, support the deployment of sites in rural areas, streamline right of ways, etc. But important here, is notice that there are true global trends, not only the emergence of tower companies, but also the introduction of 5G, what means that it's necessary more density to deploy 5G infrastructure because this technology use high band spectrum, and consequently it's necessary to speed up the process to deploy these massive amount of cells. In this context, tower companies are trying to change their business model or evolve, not only offering towers, but also entering into new assets and services. That is why there are also new items, new kind of regulation addressed applicable only for tower companies, such as license or registration required by tower companies that include this license sometimes comes with certain requirements of offering, for example, give their business model, fees to operate, and also concerns about national security. Therefore, there are foreign ownership restrictions for these tower companies. As we said, these tower companies currently, some of them, not only depending on the structure of the market and their capacity, they are considering the possibility to become strategic partners of mobile operators. So so they want to offer other assets and services. We will see here in the next slide some examples for India and the UK. If, for example, we see that in India, the right-of-way rules were implemented in 2016, and they were amended recently in order to speed up the process of deploying 5G. In India, these tower companies don't need any license, but only a registration. And the regulator in India have recommended that tower companies should be allowed to own, establish, maintain, and operate all kinds of infrastructure, including active infrastructure. So the regulator in India is enabling these tower companies to evolve through the offering of other kind of infrastructure. The same happened in the UK, where there are recently new rules for mobile masts, recently in April 22, but also regarding sharing, the UK government launched the Shared Rural Network in 2020 in cooperation with mobile networks. Also in UK, there is no need of license for tower companies, but they could apply to the regulator for code powers in order to deploy infrastructure on the streets. Again, the regulator in the UK has allowed neutral hosts and tower companies to offer small cells and active sharing. So they are also enabling tower companies to evolve through other assets. Now, if these kind of countries, UK and India, have developed market for tower companies. The same happened in the United States and some member states in Europe, but that is not the case for other regions. As we saw before, in the next slide, we will see that there are different approaches for regulation depending on the tower market structure and the objective of the regulator. We see in the previous examples that we gave that when the market is homogeneous, that means that there are an homogeneous share among the three largest tower companies. So the objective of the regulation is not enabling tower companies to enter the market because they are already there, but enabling these tower companies to evolve or to deploy their infrastructure. However, in other markets, mainly in Africa, where there are no tower company or less than 5% of market share. In other countries, there are concentrated tower markets. For example, there are in Angola, Kenya, Tanzania, and Zambia, there are concentrated markets with only one or the most two tower companies. In Algeria, Chad, Mozambique, and Niger, there are no tower companies. In concentrated markets, it's important to notice that the tower company market offers decreasing returns to scale beyond a certain number of towers. So there is possibility for other new tower companies to enter the market with efficiencies. So depending on this market structure, there are differences in this approach of regulator. In developed countries, it's enabling tower companies to evolve through new assets and services. In African countries, mainly is allowing the entering of these new infrastructure players. So, Elena, could you give the main takeaways?
Yes, so I think we have to say that there are two main takeaways from this presentation. One is about the structural evolution of the tower ecosystem, because as we said, emergence of independent tower companies, major restructuring of mobile network operators, but also a high interest by other type of investors, like institutional investors, who are increasingly investing in this type of infrastructure. And we have seen the reasons for that. Then there is also this regulatory evolution, and this is about competition entry, consolidation, and market power. As we said before, competition authorities are increasingly looking at this ecosystem. At the same time, there is the need to to see the evolution of regulatory environments, also depending on the market structure. So the regulations are evolving depending on this evolving market structure. And important role of the regulatory authorities in this field that must be very careful in adapting to a fast evolving environment that can affect competition, can affect also deployment of infrastructure, and so ultimately the growth in this sector. So I think we have finished now. I don't know if there is time for questions and answers. For sure, we will answer your questions in writing, so don't worry, we will come back to you. Sarah, what is the situation?
Yeah, well, we have quite some questions, but I guess we won't have time to answer all of them, but I will send them to you, so you can answer everyone. But maybe, Elena, just one question, because I think it's still quite interesting. What about the situation in Africa?
Well, the situation in Africa, yes, of course, I covered the 3 continents, and but Africa is absolutely relevant. Also, as Javier explained, there are the market structures there are very, very challenging, very different. I would like to point out, however, that the 3 groups have been growing significantly in the Africa continent, and also in some Middle Eastern market. For example, this is the case of IHS that has now over 30,000 towers in 8 countries in the African continent. Also, American Tower is the second largest independent tower company in the African continent, with around 23,000 in 7 countries. So it's let's say that they made some acquisitions in several countries, and and they started quite early. I mean, some of the acquisitions date back 2011, 2012, so quite early. The process started early, but there is not that type of consolidation that we observe already in other parts of the world. Helios also is another group from the UK, and they also have are present, I think, in around 9 or 10 countries in Africa. So these groups are certainly interested. So the message is that there is a lot of interest to grow in Africa. At the same time, the mobile restructuring and the restructuring in general of this sector is evolving, because and it's not at the same stage as we observe in other regions, like, for example, in Europe or in the United States. It is more similar to what we see, for example, in emerging Asia. And so we discussed two cases in Asia. There are some groups, like, for example, Ooredoo, that announced in September the intention to, restructure their tower activity. So there is a lot of movement, a lot of interest. So I think for sure we can expect 2023 as another very dynamic scenario for this sector, for sure. And so the regulation, which we'll continue monitoring for sure.
So wait and see.
Yes.
Okay, and maybe just one last question, because we're running out of time, maybe more for Javier. How effective have been the right-of-way rules in India to improve the site deployment around the country?
Well, in India, as I said before in the presentation, there are new rules of right-of-way in 2016, because the previous right-of-way rules dated from the the 80s, I think 1985, more or less. So it was a big problem to, well, India is a complex country with many states. But in 2016, these rules try to homogenize to implement rules at national-wide level. According to the Minister of India, that allowed to reduce the time for approvals, sometimes more than many months, to only 2 or 3 weeks. But even so, recently, as we commented, the regulator in India amended those rules, because there are still problems, certain bottlenecks to deploy infrastructure to get certain approvals and free access, but mainly to deployment of 5G. But we will continue monitoring what is happening.
So it's also a wait and see situation.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm really sorry, but we're running out of time. So I just wanted to thank once again Javier and Elena, and also our great audience. So don't worry, we will answer your questions by email. Maybe not today, of course, but we will do it. It's important for us. And yeah, so next webinar is coming very soon, already in February, so stay tuned. And it will also be about global trends around regulatory topics, so really stay tuned. One last thing, don't forget to give us some feedback. I remind you that we will plant trees, so if you don't do it for us, do it for the planet. And keep yeah, we hope to see you at future events, and hope to stay connected. Elena, Javier, one last word, maybe?
Yes, we would like to wish Happy New Year.
Yeah.
It's
Happy
coming,
holidays.
so, and happy holidays for everyone. We deserve some holiday.
This was our last event of this year,
Yes.
but we will be back.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you also for organizing these webinars. You are a precious support for us.
My pleasure. Okay, so goodbye, everybody.